The gunshot cracked through the silent dawn like thunder, startling Teresa Fullerton from her restless sleep. She bolted upright in her bed, the quilted coverlet clutched tightly to her chest as her heart pounded wildly. It wasn't the sound itself that frightened her. Gunfire was common enough in Dustwater, Colorado in 1879. It was what that particular shot represented. One day closer to her wedding to Harold Winters, the man who owned half the county and, according to her father's arrangement, would soon own her as well. Teresa pushed aside her covers and moved to the window, parting the curtains to reveal the sprawling ranch that had been her home for all 20 years of her life. Her father's prized cattle dotted the pasture, blissfully unaware of the turmoil churning inside the young woman watching them from the window. The golden light of sunrise painted the landscape in warm hues, but Teresa felt only coldness spreading through her chest. 3 more days, she whispered to herself, the words bitter on her tongue. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet as she crossed to her dresser. She splashed water from the porcelain basin onto her face, avoiding her reflection in the mirror. Teresa didn't need to see the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of another night spent fighting tears rather than sleeping. A soft knock at her door pulled her attention away from her thoughts. "Miss Teresa." It was Martha, the housekeeper who had helped raise Teresa after her mother died in childbirth. "Your father requests you join him for breakfast." "Tell him I'll be down shortly," Teresa replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She dressed quickly in a simple blue day dress, pinning her chestnut hair into a modest bun at the nape of her neck. Her fingers trembled slightly as she secured the last hairpin, and she took a deep breath to calm her nerves before heading downstairs. Thomas Fullerton sat at the head of the long dining table, his weathered face hidden behind a newspaper. At 55, he was still a formidable man, with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of decades of hard work. He'd built the Fullerton Ranch from nothing, a fact he never allowed Teresa to forget. "Good morning, Father," Teresa said quietly, taking her seat to his right. Thomas folded his paper and set it aside, his gray eyes appraising her. "You look pale. I trust you're not falling ill before the ceremony." It wasn't a question of concern, but a statement of expectation. Teresa reached for the coffee pot, pouring herself a cup to hide the tremor in her hands. "I'm perfectly well," she replied. "Just a bit of trouble sleeping." "Pre-wedding jitters, no doubt." Thomas cut into his steak with precision. "Harold stopped by last night while you were resting. He's quite eager to finalize the arrangements." Teresa's stomach twisted. Harold Winters was 47 years old, more than twice her age, with cold eyes, and a reputation for ruthlessness in business and pleasure alike. The thought of becoming his wife made her physically ill. "Father," she began cautiously, "I was hoping we might discuss." "There's nothing to discuss," Thomas interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The arrangements have been made. The banknote comes due next week, and Harold has generously agreed to forgive the debt in exchange for your hand. The Fullerton legacy will continue, and you'll want for nothing as Mrs. Winters." "Except love," Teresa whispered before she could stop herself. Thomas set down his fork with deliberate slowness. "Love is a luxury we cannot afford, Teresa. Your mother filled your head with fairy tales. God rest her soul, but this is reality. Harold can provide for you, protect you. That's worth more than any fleeting emotion." Teresa stared down at her untouched plate. "You loved Mother." A flicker of something pain, perhaps, or regret passed across Thomas's face before his expression hardened once more. "And losing her nearly destroyed me. I'll not have you facing the same uncertain future she did. This union secures everything." "Everything except my happiness," Teresa said, but her father had already returned to his newspaper. The conversation effectively ended. After breakfast, Teresa escaped to the stables, finding solace in the familiar scents of hay and leather. She approached her mare, Willow, stroking the horse's velvety nose as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "What am I to do?" she whispered to the mare. "Father has given his word. The whole town will be at the church on Saturday. I feel as though I'm walking to my execution rather than my wedding." "Talking to horses now, Miss Fullerton?" a deep voice asked from behind her. Teresa whirled around, hastily wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Matthew Nash leaned against the stable door, his tall frame silhouetted by the morning light. With sun-bronzed skin, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and eyes the color of a summer storm, he was easily the most handsome man in the county, and the one person who could make Teresa's heart race with a single glance. "Willow is an excellent listener," Teresa replied, attempting to sound composed despite her tear-stained face. "Unlike most people, she doesn't offer unwanted opinions." Matthew stepped into the stable, moving with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. At 26, he was already renowned as one of the best horse trainers in Colorado Territory, hired by Thomas Fullerton 2 years ago to work with the ranch's prized stock. "My apologies for intruding," he said, his voice softening as he noticed her reddened eyes. "I came to check on Thunderclap's hoof, but I can come back later." "No, please stay," Teresa said quickly, surprising herself with her eagerness. "I could use the company, even if it comes with opinions." Matthew smiled, a warm gesture that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'm afraid I'm fresh out of opinions this early in the morning. All I've got is coffee, if you'd care to share." He pulled a metal flask from his vest pocket and offered it to her. Teresa hesitated only briefly before accepting. The rich, strong brew was a welcome comfort, and she found herself relaxing in Matthew's presence despite her earlier distress. "Thank you," she said, returning the flask. Their fingers brushed, and Teresa felt a familiar flutter in her chest, one she'd been trying desperately to ignore for months. "You want to talk about what's troubling you?" Matthew asked, leaning against Willow's stall. "Or would you prefer I pretend not to notice you've been crying?" Teresa looked away, embarrassed. "It's nothing that talking will solve." Matthew crossed his arms, studying her with those perceptive gray eyes. "This wouldn't have anything to do with your upcoming nuptials, would it? Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been watching you fade like a flower without water these past few weeks." His voice held a note of concern that made Teresa's throat tighten with emotion. "Father says I should be grateful," she said bitterly. "Harold Winters is wealthy and respected. The match will save the ranch and secure my future." "And what about your heart?" Matthew asked quietly. Teresa met his gaze, startled by the directness of his question. "Father says that's a luxury we cannot afford." "Your father's wrong," Matthew replied, the certainty in his voice making Teresa's pulse quicken. "Some things are worth more than gold or land, Miss Fullerton." "Teresa," she corrected him automatically. "Please call me Teresa. After 2 years, I think we've earned that familiarity." A smile tugged at the corner of Matthew's mouth. "Teresa, then." The way he said her name like it was something precious sent warmth spreading through her chest. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the only sounds the soft nickering of horses and the distant lowing of cattle. Teresa found herself studying Matthew's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight cleft in his chin, the way his dark eyelashes cast shadows on his cheeks when he looked down. "Have you ever been in love, Mr. Nash?" she asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could reconsider. "Matthew," he corrected with a gentle smile, "and yes, I have." Teresa's heart sank unexpectedly. "Oh, I didn't realize once," he continued, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. Only once. Something in his gaze made her cheeks flush, and Teresa looked away first, suddenly afraid of what might be revealed in her own expression. "What happened?" she asked softly. Matthew's smile turned sad. "She was promised to another." The simple statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Teresa's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "And did you fight for her?" she whispered. "I'm still fighting," Matthew replied, his voice dropping to match hers, "though I'm not sure she knows it yet." Before Teresa could respond, the stable door swung open and Thomas Fullerton stepped inside, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the hay-strewn floor. "Teresa," he called, his tone sharp, "I've been looking everywhere for you. Harold has arrived with the seamstress for your final fitting." Teresa straightened, her momentary happiness evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. "Yes, father, I'm coming." Matthew tipped his hat politely. "Mr. Fullerton, Miss Fullerton." His voice was carefully neutral, but Teresa caught the flash of something fierce in his eyes before he turned away, leading thunderclap from his stall. As Teresa followed her father back to the house, she couldn't help glancing over her shoulder. Matthew stood watching her, his tall figure framed by the stable doorway. And in that moment, Teresa felt something shift within her, a spark of hope where before there had been only resignation. The fitting was torturous. Teresa stood perfectly still as the seamstress, Mrs. Peterson, fussed around her, pinning and tucking the elaborate wedding gown while Harold Winters observed from a chair in the corner, his gaze making Teresa's skin crawl. "You'll be the most beautiful bride Dustwater has ever seen," Harold commented, his thin lips stretching into what might have been intended as a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Winters," Teresa replied automatically, the words feeling like ashes in her mouth. Harold rose from his chair, approaching until he stood uncomfortably close. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Teresa's cheek. "I do hope you'll call me Harold, my dear. After all, in just 3 days, you'll be my wife." Teresa forced herself not to flinch at his touch. "Of course." Harold. Satisfied, he stepped back, addressing Thomas, who stood by the doorway. "I've finalized arrangements with Reverend Johnson. The ceremony will begin promptly at noon on Saturday. Half the county will be in attendance." His tone was self-satisfied, as though the wedding were a business acquisition to be proud of rather than a sacred union. "Excellent," Thomas replied, nodding approvingly. "The Fullerton-Winters alliance will be the talk of the territory." Alliance. As though this were a treaty between warring nations rather than her life, her future. Teresa bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to taste blood, using the pain to keep from screaming aloud. "There we are, Miss Fullerton," Mrs. Peterson said, stepping back to admire her work. "Just a few minor adjustments, and your gown will be ready for Saturday." "It's lovely," Teresa said dully, looking at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The dress was beautiful. She had to admit, ivory silk with delicate lace trim and tiny seed pearls adorning the bodice. It was the sort of gown any young woman might dream of wearing on her wedding day. Any young woman marrying for love, that is. "You may change now," Mrs. Peterson instructed, helping Teresa step carefully out of the gown. Once she was dressed in her day clothes again, Teresa excused herself, claiming a headache. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her temples throbbed with tension, and her chest felt tight with unshed tears. She retreated to the garden behind the house, seeking solace among her mother's roses. Elizabeth Fullerton had loved flowers, creating this garden with her own hands in the early years of her marriage. It was one of the few connections Teresa still had to the mother she'd never known. "You would have understood," Teresa whispered, gently touching a velvety red petal. "You married for love. Father says it was foolish, but I've seen how he looks at your portrait when he thinks no one is watching. He's never stopped loving you. Talking to flowers now. Matthew's voice drifted over the garden wall. First horses, now roses. People might start to wonder about you, Teresa Fullerton. Despite everything, Teresa found herself smiling as Matthew appeared around the corner, his hat in his hands. "The roses give better advice than the horses," she replied, wiping discreetly at her eyes. Matthew's expression softened as he noticed her distress. Without a word, he moved to sit beside her on the stone bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him but not so close as to be improper. "I saw Winters arrive," he said quietly. "How are you holding up?" Teresa let out a shaky breath. "My wedding dress is beautiful. The church will be filled with flowers. The reception will feature a 7-tier cake imported from Denver." She turned to Matthew, no longer bothering to hide her tears. "And I feel as though I'm being sentenced to a lifetime of misery rather than celebrating the happiest day of my life." Matthew's jaw tightened, a muscle working in his cheek. "You don't have to go through with this, Teresa." She laughed bitterly. "Don't I? Father has given his word." "The debt, hang the debt," Matthew interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "Your father's financial troubles don't justify selling his daughter to a man old enough to be her father." "There's nowhere for me to go," Teresa said helplessly. "No way out." Matthew reached for her hand then, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. The touch was improper, forbidden even, but Teresa couldn't bring herself to pull away. Instead, she found herself clinging to him like a lifeline. "What if there was?" he asked, his gray eyes searching hers. "What if you had a choice?" Teresa's breath caught in her throat. "Matthew, what are you saying?" Before he could answer, Martha's voice called from the house. "Miss Teresa, your father is asking for you." Matthew released her hand reluctantly, standing as Teresa did. "Meet me tonight," he whispered urgently. "At the old oak by Willow Creek. Midnight." Teresa hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I'll be there." The rest of the day passed in a blur of wedding preparations and forced smiles. Harold stayed for dinner, seated at Thomas's right hand while Teresa picked at her food, her thoughts fixed firmly on midnight and whatever Matthew Nash had to say to her. When the grandfather clock in the hallway finally struck 12, Teresa was already dressed, a dark cloak thrown over her nightgown and her hair hanging loose down her back. She slipped out through the kitchen door, moving silently across the moonlit grounds toward Willow Creek. The ancient oak tree stood sentinel at the edge of the water, its massive branches reaching toward the star-strewn sky. Matthew was already waiting, his tall figure easy to distinguish even in the darkness. He turned at the sound of her approach, relief washing over his features. "You came," he said softly. "Did you doubt I would?" Teresa asked, coming to stand before him. Matthew shook his head. "No, but I feared your father might have posted guards at your door, considering how valuable his investment is." The bitterness in his tone matched the feeling in Teresa's heart. "Not yet, though I wouldn't put it past him as the wedding draws nearer." She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Why did you ask me to come here, Matthew?" Instead of answering immediately, Matthew reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, holding it out to her. Teresa took it, unfolding the document carefully. In the moonlight, it was difficult to make out the words, but the official-looking stamp and signature at the bottom were clear enough. "It looks like a deed." "It is," Matthew confirmed, "for a parcel of land up north near the Wyoming border. 160 acres of prime grazing land with a stream running right through the middle of it." He paused, watching her face. "My land, Teresa. Land I've been working and saving for since I was 16 years old." Teresa looked up from the document, puzzled. "I don't understand." 2 years ago, I came here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a dream of someday having enough to offer a woman a good life, Matthew said, his voice low and intense. I've worked every day since then, saving every penny, building something from nothing. He took a deep breath. Because the moment I saw you, I knew you were the one I was building it for. Teresa's heart began to race. Matthew, let me finish, please, he said gently. I know I have no right. I'm just a horse trainer with no family name, no fortune. Your father would never approve and society would deem me unworthy. But I can't stand by and watch you sacrifice yourself for your father's debts. He took both her hands in his, the deed crushed between their palms. Come with me, Teresa. Tonight. We can be in Wyoming by this time tomorrow, start a new life together. His eyes searched hers, hope and fear mingling in their depths. I know it's not the life you were born to, but I swear I'll spend every day making you happy. Teresa stood frozen, overwhelmed by his words. You're asking me to run away. I'm asking you to choose your own path, Matthew corrected. To follow your heart instead of your father's orders. But the ranch is not your responsibility, Matthew insisted. Your father made poor investments and borrowed more than he could repay. That's not your burden to bear, Teresa. And Harold, she whispered. Matthew's expression hardened. Winters will find another young woman to intimidate and control. Men like him always do. Teresa turned away, her thoughts whirling. The idea was madness, abandoning her home, her father, everything she'd ever known. And yet the alternative was equally unthinkable. A lifetime bound to Harold Winters, bearing his children, enduring his touch. If we leave, she said slowly, Harold will come after us. He's not a man who accepts defeat easily. Let him try, Matthew replied, a steely edge to his voice. Wyoming is a big territory, and I've friends there who would help us. We could disappear, start fresh where no one knows us. Teresa looked up at the stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. Somewhere in that vastness was the freedom she'd always longed for, the chance to live on her own terms, to love whom she chose. When would we leave? She asked, her decision made even as the words left her lips. Matthew's face lit up with a joy so pure it took her breath away. Tomorrow night, after the ranch hands have gone to town for their weekly visit to the saloon, your father will be at his club meeting and the house will be quiet. What should I bring? Only what you can carry in a small bag, Matthew advised. Practical clothes, anything of sentimental value. I have supplies waiting at a camp outside town, food, bedrolls, everything we'll need for the journey. Teresa nodded, her mind already cataloging what she would take. Her mother's locket, a few photographs, the book of poetry that had been her constant companion during lonely nights. Matthew, she said hesitantly, have you considered what this will mean for you? You'll be giving up your position here, your reputation. The only reputation I care about is the one I have in your eyes, he replied simply. As for my position, I've already spoken with the owner of the Star Creek Ranch in Wyoming. There's a job waiting for me there for us, if you'll have me. Teresa looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there, not one of wealth and status, perhaps, but one filled with something far more precious. Love freely given, a partnership of equals rather than the ownership Harold Winters offered. Yes, she whispered, allowing herself to step closer to him. Yes, I'll have you. Matthew's hand came up to cradle her cheek, his touch gentle as reverence. I've dreamed of hearing those words since the day we met, he confessed, his voice husky with emotion. In the silver moonlight, beneath the ancient oak, Teresa did something she'd never dared before. She rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to Matthew's in a kiss that sealed their pact. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. becoming a promise of all that awaited them. When they finally parted, Teresa felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, fear giving way to determination, resignation transforming into hope. "Tomorrow night," Matthew confirmed, reluctantly releasing her. "Meet me here at 10 o'clock. Bring only what matters most." "I'll be here," Teresa promised, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "The only thing that truly matters will be waiting for me right here." With one last lingering look, Teresa turned and hurried back toward the house, her steps quick and purposeful. For the first time since her father had announced her betrothal to Harold Winters, she felt in control of her own destiny. She slept fitfully that night, dreams of freedom alternating with nightmares of being caught. When dawn broke, Teresa rose and dressed with particular care, knowing she needed to avoid arousing suspicion. She packed a small carpet bag when no one was watching, hiding it beneath her bed for the evening's escape. At breakfast, Thomas commented on her improved color. "You look better this morning. I trust you're finally reconciling yourself to your duty." Teresa smiled enigmatically. "I've come to terms with my future, yes." "Excellent," Thomas replied, clearly satisfied with her response. "Harold will be pleased. He's arranged for a photographer from Denver to document the ceremony. Quite progressive of him." "Indeed," Teresa murmured, focusing on her toast to hide the rebellion in her eyes. The day progressed with agonizing slowness. Teresa moved through her usual routines like an actress in a play, her mind fixed firmly on the night ahead. She avoided the stables, knowing that seeing Matthew in daylight might betray their plans through a telling glance or word. When evening finally arrived, Teresa pleaded exhaustion and retired to her room early, citing wedding preparations as the cause of her fatigue. Thomas seemed pleased by her conscientiousness, kissing her forehead before departing for his weekly meeting at the Dustwater Gentlemen's Club. "Rest well, daughter," he said. "Only 2 more days until you make me proud." Teresa's smile felt brittle on her face. "Good night, father." The moment his carriage pulled away, Teresa sprang into action. She changed quickly into her plainest dress, a sturdy blue cotton with minimal embellishments and practical boots. Around her neck, she fastened her mother's locket, tucking it beneath her collar for safekeeping. Into her carpet bag went a change of clothes, her hairbrush, the book of poetry, and a small framed photograph of her mother. As an afterthought, she added the pearl earrings that had been her 18th birthday gift from her father. Not to keep, but perhaps to sell if they found themselves in need of funds along the journey. She penned a brief note, leaving it on her dressing table where it would be easily found. "Father, I cannot marry a man I do not love. Please forgive me, but I must follow my heart as Mother would have wanted. Do not look for me. With love always, Teresa." At 9:45, Teresa slipped downstairs, avoiding the creaky third step from habit. Martha was in the kitchen, but the housekeeper's hearing wasn't what it once was, and the clatter of pots and pans covered the soft sound of the side door opening and closing. The night air was cool against Teresa's flushed cheeks as she hurried across the grounds, keeping to the shadows. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration, each step taking her further from the life that had been planned for her and closer to one she was choosing for herself. The ancient oak loomed ahead, its massive silhouette black against the star-strewn sky. Teresa quickened her pace, eager to reach Matthew and begin their journey together. But as she approached, she realized with a sinking heart that the tree stood alone, no tall figure waiting beneath its spreading branches. Teresa glanced around anxiously, wondering if she'd somehow misunderstood their meeting place. "Matthew," she called softly, fear beginning to curl in her stomach. "Are you here?" Only silence answered her. She set down her bag and paced beneath the tree, checking her father's pocket watch that she'd borrowed without permission. 10 minutes past the hour. Perhaps he'd been delayed. Perhaps the sound of hoofbeats approaching made Teresa's breath catch. Relief flooded through her as she stepped out from beneath the oak's canopy, ready to greet Matthew. But it wasn't Matthew who emerged from the darkness. Harold Winters reined his horse to a stop, his thin face twisted into a smile that sent ice through Teresa's veins. Behind him rode two of his ranch hands, their expressions grim in the moonlight. "Well, well," Harold drawled, dismounting with fluid grace despite his years. "What have we here? A young bride to be out for a midnight stroll." Teresa backed away, her mind racing. "Mr. Winters, I couldn't sleep. The fresh air helps." Harold's eyes flicked to the carpet bag at the base of the tree. "With luggage? How practical of you. How did you know I would be here?" Teresa demanded, abandoning the pretense. Harold stepped closer, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "Your father may trust Nash, but I make it my business to know the character of every man who works for me, or who soon will." He gestured to one of his men. "Simmons here observed your little rendezvous last night. Quite touching, I'm told." Terror gripped Teresa's heart. "Where is Matthew?" "Ah, so it's Matthew now, is it?" Harold's voice hardened. "Your cowboy Romeo won't be joining us tonight, I'm afraid. He's been detained." "What have you done to him?" Teresa's voice rose with panic. Harold waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing permanent, yet my men are simply explaining the consequences of stealing what belongs to another man." His eyes raked over Teresa in a way that made her skin crawl. "And make no mistake, Miss Fullerton, you do belong to me. Your father signed the contracts yesterday." "I am not property to be bought and sold," Teresa spat, anger overriding her fear. "And I will never marry you, Harold Winters, not if you were the last man in Colorado territory." Harold's facade of civility slipped, revealing the cruelty beneath. He grabbed Teresa's arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "You have spirit, I'll grant you that. Breaking it will be most entertaining." He turned to his men. "Secure her horse. Miss Fullerton will be riding with me back to town, where she'll remain under lock and key until our wedding day." "No." Teresa struggled against his grip, managing to wrench free. She turned to run, but Harold was surprisingly fast for his age. He caught her around the waist, lifting her off her feet as she kicked and fought. "Let me go," she screamed, no longer caring who might hear. "Help! Someone help me!" "Scream all you want," Harold hissed in her ear. "No one will hear you out here, and if they did, what would they do? Your father gave you to me, girl. The law is on my side." Teresa felt despair washing over her as Harold dragged her toward his horse. Her dreams of freedom were evaporating like morning mist, replaced by the nightmare of captivity that awaited her. Then, without warning, a shot rang out, the sound echoing across the open land. Harold froze, his grip on Teresa loosening slightly. "I believe the lady asked you to let her go," a familiar voice called from the darkness. Matthew stepped into view, a rifle trained steadily on Harold Winters. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and his left arm hung awkwardly at his side, but his aim didn't waver. Behind him, Teresa could make out two figures slumped on the ground, Harold's men, subdued but alive. "Nash," Harold snarled, "you're making a grave mistake." "The only mistake was thinking I wouldn't fight for her," Matthew replied, his voice deadly calm. "Now, take your hands off Teresa before I put a hole through that expensive coat of yours." Harold hesitated, calculation evident in his eyes. Then slowly he released Teresa, pushing her roughly away from him. She stumbled but kept her footing, quickly moving to stand beside Matthew. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked, his eyes never leaving Harold. "Yes," Teresa breathed, "but you're hurt." "Nothing that won't heal," he assured her. There's a horse waiting beyond those trees. Go to it, now." Teresa hesitated, unwilling to leave him facing Harold alone. "You won't get away with this, Nash," Harold warned, his voice cold with rage. "I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. There's nowhere you can hide that my money can't reach." "Perhaps," Matthew acknowledged, "but I'm willing to take that chance." His eyes flickered briefly to Teresa. "Go," he urged. "I'll be right behind you." This time Teresa obeyed, retrieving her bag and hurrying toward the trees. She glanced back once to see Matthew backing away, the rifle still trained on Harold Winters, who stood seething with impotent fury beneath the ancient oak. The promised horse was indeed waiting Matthew's own gelding, Valor, saddled and ready. Teresa secured her bag and mounted, her heart pounding as she waited for Matthew to join her. The minutes stretched like hours, each second an agony of fear that another shot would ring out in the darkness. Finally, Matthew appeared, moving swiftly despite his injuries. He swung up behind Teresa on the horse, his strong arm encircling her waist as he took the reins. "Hold tight," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." They galloped away from Willow Creek, from the Fullerton Ranch, from the life that had been planned out for Teresa without her consent. The night air whipped her hair, and the steady rhythm of Valor's hooves matched the wild beating of her heart. "What happened?" she asked when they slowed to give the horse a breather. "Harold said his men detained you." Matthew's chuckle held no humor. "They tried. 3 of them jumped me as I was preparing our supplies. I managed to convince 2 of them that interfering with my plans wasn't worth the pain it would cause them. And the third was more persistent. He's the one who warned Winters." Matthew grimaced, adjusting his position. "I tracked them to Willow Creek, figuring that's where they'd intercept you." Teresa twisted in the saddle to look up at him, concern etched on her features. "Your arm, dislocated shoulder," he admitted. "I put it back, but it's going to be sore for a while." "We should stop, find a doctor." "No," Matthew interrupted firmly. "We need to put as much distance between us and Winters as possible. He wasn't bluffing about hunting us down, Teresa. A man like that doesn't take kindly to having his possessions stolen." "I was never his possession," Teresa said fiercely. Matthew's arm tightened around her waist. "No," he agreed softly. "You've always been your own woman. It's one of the countless reasons I fell in love with you." The words, spoken so simply in the darkness, made Teresa's breath catch. She leaned back against him, allowing herself to absorb the reality of their situation, the danger they faced, yes, but also the incredible freedom of having chosen her own path. "Where are we going?" she asked after they had ridden in silence for some time. "North," Matthew replied. "I have a friend with a cabin about 20 miles from here. We can rest there tonight, then continue on to Wyoming tomorrow." "And if Harold follows, he'll try," Matthew acknowledged grimly, "but I know this territory better than he does. We'll stay off the main trails, avoid towns where we might be recognized." They rode through the night, stopping only when necessary to rest the horse. By dawn, they had reached a small, secluded cabin nestled among pine trees, its chimney dark and windows shuttered. "It doesn't look like anyone's home," Teresa observed as Matthew helped her dismount, his movements careful despite his injured shoulder. "No one is. Jim only uses this place during hunting season. The rest of the year it sits empty." Matthew produced a key from his pocket. "He gave me this years ago, said I was welcome anytime." The cabin's interior was simple but clean, one room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed against one wall, and a small table with 2 chairs. A shelf held basic supplies: coffee, beans, salt pork, and the like. "It's not much," Matthew said apologetically, watching Teresa's face as she took in their surroundings. She turned to him with a genuine smile. "It's perfect," she assured him, setting down her bag. "Now sit down and let me look at your injuries." Matthew started to protest, but relented when Teresa fixed him with a determined stare. He sank onto one of the wooden chairs, wincing slightly as she gently probed the cut above his eye. "It needs cleaning," she declared, filling a basin with water from a bucket by the door. She tore a strip from one of her petticoats to use as a cloth, carefully washing away the dried blood. Matthew watched her work, his gray eyes never leaving her face. "You're handling this remarkably well," he observed. Most women raised in comfort would be falling apart at the prospect of living rough. Teresa's hands paused in their ministrations. "I'm not most women," she replied simply, "and comfort means little when it comes with a cage." "No," Matthew agreed softly, "you're certainly not most women." When she'd finished tending his injuries, Teresa busied herself with starting a fire and preparing a simple breakfast from the supplies in the cabin. They ate in companionable silence, both acutely aware of the intimacy of their situation alone together, miles from civilization, with only each other to rely on. "We should rest," Matthew suggested when they'd finished eating. "We'll need to move again by nightfall." He insisted on taking the floor, leaving the narrow bed for Teresa despite her protests. Exhaustion overtook them both quickly, the events of the night catching up with their bodies even as their minds whirled with all that had transpired. Teresa woke first, late afternoon sunlight filtering through the cabin's small windows. She found Matthew still sleeping, his face relaxed in a way she'd never seen before. Without the tension of alertness, he looked younger, vulnerable even. The sight stirred something protective in her chest. She moved quietly about the cabin, repacking her few belongings and preparing a simple meal from the remaining supplies. The domesticity of the scene struck her suddenly. She and Matthew, sharing this small space as though they'd been doing so for years, rather than hours. "Is this what our life could be?" she wondered, watching him stir as the scent of coffee reached him. Simple, perhaps, but ours. Chosen, not forced. "How long have you been up?" Matthew asked, his voice rough with sleep as he sat up. "Not long," Teresa replied, pouring coffee into a tin cup and bringing it to him. "How's your shoulder feeling?" Matthew rotated the joint carefully. "Better. Still sore, but I'll manage." He accepted the coffee gratefully, his fingers brushing hers in a way that sent warmth spreading through her despite the cabin's chill. They planned their route over the meal, Matthew sketching a rough map on the back of an old envelope. "We'll head northwest from here, staying in the foothills where the tree cover is thicker. It'll add a day or two to our journey, but it's safer than the open country." "What about towns?" Teresa asked. "We'll need supplies eventually." "There's a small settlement here," Matthew indicated a spot on his makeshift map. "Not much more than a trading post, really. The owner's a friend of Jim's. He won't ask questions if we pay in cash." Teresa nodded, committing the route to memory. "And when we reach Wyoming?" "Star Creek Ranch is here," Matthew pointed to the northern edge of his map. "About 10 miles south of Laramie. The owner, Daniel Foster, is expecting us, though perhaps not quite this soon." A wry smile tugged at his lips. "I'd planned to court you properly once your father's debt was settled. I had a whole speech prepared for when I asked for your hand." The simple admission made Teresa's heart flutter. "You can still give me that speech someday," she said softly, "when we're safe." Matthew's eyes met hers, intense and full of promise. "I intend to." They departed as dusk was falling, leaving the cabin exactly as they'd found it, save for a note of thanks and a few coins Matthew left on the table for the supplies they'd used. Valor seemed refreshed after the day's rest, carrying them steadily through the darkening landscape. They traveled by night and slept hidden during daylight hours, making steady progress northward despite the difficult terrain. On the third night, they reached the trading post Matthew had mentioned, where they purchased additional supplies, food, ammunition, and a bedroll for Matthew, who had been sleeping on the ground with only his coat for warmth. "News travels fast out here," the post's owner warned them as they prepared to leave. "Had a rider through yesterday asking about a young couple heading north. Offered a substantial reward for information." Teresa's blood ran cold at the confirmation that Harold was indeed pursuing them. "What did you tell him?" The old man shrugged. "Told him I hadn't seen hide nor hair of anyone matching that description. Wasn't lying then, either." He glanced between them, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Whatever your story is, it ain't my business. But you'd best be careful. Man like that, offering that kind of money, he ain't gonna give up easy." "We appreciate the warning," Matthew said, extending his hand. "And your discretion." The old man nodded, shaking Matthew's hand firmly. "Good luck to you both." They rode away from the trading post with renewed urgency, pushing harder through the night despite their fatigue. When they finally stopped to rest near dawn, Teresa found herself trembling with exhaustion and fear. "We'll never be free of him, will we?" she whispered as Matthew spread the bedroll for her beneath a rocky overhang that provided some shelter. "Harold will keep hunting us no matter how far we go." Matthew knelt beside her, taking her cold hands in his. "Look at me, Teresa," he said gently, waiting until she raised her eyes to his. "I promised I would keep you safe, and I will. Winters is persistent, but even he has limits. Once we cross into Wyoming territory, his influence will wane, and in time he'll find another target for his obsessions." "How can you be so sure?" "Because men like Harold Winters don't love they possess, and when one possession proves too difficult to acquire, they move on to the next." Matthew's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, a soothing gesture that steadied her racing heart. "Besides, I've something worth fighting for." "Does he?" The question hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Teresa looked into Matthew's gray eyes, seeing the depth of feeling there that Harold Winters could never comprehend. For Harold, she was a prize to be won, a young wife to display as evidence of his power and influence. For Matthew she was everything. "No," she said finally. "He doesn't." They continued their journey, each day bringing them closer to the Wyoming border and further from the life Teresa had left behind. The terrain grew more rugged, the air cooler as they climbed through mountain passes still dusted with spring snow. On the sixth night since their escape, they crested a ridge and paused, gazing down at the valley spread below them. In the moonlight, Teresa could make out the silvery ribbon of a river winding through the landscape. "Welcome to Wyoming territory," Matthew said softly. "Star Creek Ranch is less than a day's ride from here." Teresa felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They had made it. They were beyond Thomas Fullerton's influence, beyond the immediate reach of Harold Winters's money and connections. For the first time since they'd fled, she allowed herself to truly believe in the possibility of a future with Matthew. "What will it be like?" she asked, trying to picture the ranch that would become their home. "Star Creek, beautiful," Matthew replied, his voice warm with anticipation. "The main house sits on a rise overlooking the creek that gives the place its name. There are wild strawberries growing along the banks in summer, and the sunsets turn the whole valley gold." He glanced at her, suddenly hesitant. "It's not as grand as Fullerton Ranch, of course." "I don't need grand," Teresa assured him. "I just need—" She trailed off, suddenly shy about voicing the truth that had become increasingly clear during their journey. "What do you need, Teresa?" Matthew asked gently. She met his gaze, finding courage in the tenderness she saw there. "You," she said simply. "I just need you." Matthew's breath caught audibly. For a moment, he seemed frozen, as though afraid any movement might shatter the perfection of her words. Then, slowly, he leaned forward, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek as his lips found hers. Unlike their first kiss beneath the oak tree, this one held no desperation, no fear of discovery or separation. It was a kiss of promise, of certainty deep and unhurried, as though they had all the time in the world. Teresa wound her arms around Matthew's neck, drawing him closer as the last barriers between them fell away. When they finally parted, both breathless, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Teresa Fullerton," he whispered. "I think I've loved you since the first moment. I saw you talking to that mare in the stables, sunlight in your hair and determination in your eyes." "And I love you, Matthew Nash," Teresa replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain the feeling within her chest. "Enough to leave everything behind, enough to follow you anywhere." They made camp on the ridge that night, sleeping beneath the vast Wyoming sky with their bedrolls placed side by side. For the first time since their escape, Teresa slept deeply and dreamlessly, secure in the knowledge that they had outrun their pursuers, at least for now. They reached Star Creek Ranch the following afternoon, a sprawling property nestled in a valley lush with spring growth. The main house was exactly as Matthew had described, not grand like the Fullerton mansion, but solid and welcoming, with a wide porch and windows that caught the western light. Daniel Foster proved to be a jovial man in his 40s, with a booming laugh and firm handshake. His wife, Emily, welcomed Teresa with a warmth that brought unexpected tears to her eyes, reminding her of the maternal affection she'd missed since childhood. "Matthew wrote to us about you," Emily confided as she showed Teresa to the guest room where she would stay. "Though he neglected to mention just how lovely you are." Teresa blushed, smoothing her travel-worn dress self-consciously. "I'm afraid I'm not at my best after a week on horseback." Emily waved away her concerns. "Nonsense. Beauty that shines through trail dust and exhaustion is the genuine article." She patted Teresa's hand. "Rest now. We'll have plenty of time to get acquainted over dinner." Alone in the comfortable guest room, Teresa sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of these strangers who had opened their home to her and Matthew. It was a stark contrast to the cold calculation that had defined her father's household, where every interaction was weighed for its potential advantage. After washing and changing into the cleanest of her dresses, Teresa joined the Fosters and Matthew for dinner. The conversation flowed easily, with no mention of their hasty departure from Colorado or the circumstances that had necessitated it. Instead, they spoke of the ranch, of the spring calving that was nearly complete, of plans for improving the northern pastures where Matthew would be working. "We've a cabin ready for you," Daniel informed them as Emily served apple pie for dessert. "Nothing fancy, but sound and weather-tight. It's about a mile from the main house, close enough for convenience but far enough for privacy." Matthew glanced at Teresa, a question in his eyes. "That's very generous, but it's perfect," Teresa interrupted, understanding his hesitation. They had not yet discussed the practical aspects of their new life, whether they would live together, whether they would marry. But in that moment, the decision seemed as natural as breathing. "Thank you, Mr. Foster." "Daniel, please," he insisted. "And it's the least we can do. Matthew saved my son's life 2 years back when the boy took a fall into Star Creek during the spring melt. We've considered him family ever since." Later, as they walked in the garden behind the main house, Matthew took Teresa's hand, his expression serious. "About the cabin," he began. "I don't want you to feel I don't," Teresa assured him. "Feel pressured, that is. In fact, nothing has ever felt more right to me." Relief washed over Matthew's features. "Even so, I intend to do this properly." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object which gleamed in the fading light. "I've carried this since the day I decided to ask you to come away with me. It was my mother's." He dropped to one knee before her, holding up a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "Teresa Fullerton, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not because anyone has arranged it, not because of property or alliances, but because you choose to of your own free will." Tears blurred Teresa's vision as she looked down at the man kneeling before her, this man who had risked everything to give her a choice, who loved her enough to let her decide her own fate. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching. "Yes, Matthew Nash, I will marry you, because I choose to. Because I love you." Matthew slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache with joy. This was what her father had never understood, what Harold Winters could never offer: love freely given, with no conditions, no ownership, no debt to be paid. They were married 3 weeks later in the Star Creek Ranch garden, with Daniel Foster officiating and Emily standing as Teresa's witness. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly beneath the blooming apple trees. "I take you, Teresa, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Matthew said, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. "I promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life, to honor your choices, to stand beside you as your equal and your partner from this day forward." "I take you, Matthew, to be my lawfully wedded husband," Teresa replied, her heart so full she could barely speak. "I promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life, to walk with you in joy and in sorrow, to build a life of our own making together, from this day forward." As Matthew slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, Teresa felt the last vestiges of her old life falling away. She was no longer Thomas Fullerton's daughter, no longer the bride promised to Harold Winters. She was Teresa Nash now, a woman who had chosen her own path, her own love, her own destiny. The small cabin Daniel had promised them became home, a place they filled with simple furniture crafted by Matthew's hands and touches of beauty Teresa added. Wildflowers in a jar on the table, curtains she sewed from fabric Emily helped her select, a braided rug before the hearth. Matthew worked long hours with the ranch's horses, his reputation as a trainer growing until ranchers from miles around brought their stock to Star Creek. Teresa found her own place in their new community, using the education her father had insisted upon to teach the children of ranch hands and neighboring homesteaders. 6 months after their arrival in Wyoming, a letter arrived from Colorado. Teresa recognized Martha's careful handwriting on the envelope and opened it with trembling fingers, Matthew's reassuring presence beside her. "Your father suffered an apoplexy," Martha wrote. "He is recovered now, though weakened. The ranch has been sold to cover his debts, not to Mr. Winters, who withdrew his offer after your departure, but to the Morrison family from Denver. Your father now resides with your aunt in Boulder." Teresa read the letter twice, emotions warring within her: concern for the father who had tried to sell her future, relief that he was recovering, sadness for the loss of her childhood home. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked softly when she finally set the letter aside. Teresa considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said at last. "I'm sorry for his suffering, but—" She looked around their small cabin, at the life they were building together, at the man who had given her the freedom to choose. "I have no regrets, Matthew, not one." He gathered her into his arms, holding her close as the evening shadows lengthened across their floor. "Nor do I, my love, nor do I." As summer turned to fall and fall to winter, their lives settled into a rhythm of work and companionship. They weathered their first Wyoming blizzard wrapped in quilts before their fireplace, reading aloud to each other from the few books they owned. They celebrated Christmas with the Fosters, exchanging modest gifts and sharing a feast that reminded Teresa of home without the weight of expectation that had always accompanied such occasions at Fullerton Ranch. In the spring, Teresa discovered she was with child. She told Matthew as they planted a garden beside their cabin, his hands covered in rich black soil as he prepared the earth for seeds. "A baby," he repeated, joy dawning on his face like the sunrise. "We're going to have a baby." Teresa nodded, laughing as he swept her into his arms, dirt and all, spinning her around beneath the clear Wyoming sky. "In autumn," she confirmed, "around the time of the harvest." That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Matthew's hand resting protectively over her still flat abdomen, Teresa found herself thinking of the life that might have been hers had she not fled as Mrs. Harold Winters, trapped in a loveless marriage, her body merely a vessel for producing an heir. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew murmured, sensing her wakefulness. "How different things might have been," Teresa admitted. "How close I came to a life without this, without you, without love." Matthew propped himself up on one elbow, studying her face in the moonlight that filtered through their window. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving everything behind?" Teresa reached up to touch his cheek, her heart full to bursting with the certainty of her answer. "Never, not for a single moment." The child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Teresa's mother, was born as autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and crimson. She had Matthew's gray eyes and Teresa's determined spirit, evident from her very first breath. When Elizabeth was 2 months old, another letter arrived from Colorado, this one bearing Harold Winters's precise handwriting. Matthew found Teresa on the porch, the unopened letter in her hands, fear etched on her features. "He's found us," she whispered. Matthew sat beside her, his arm encircling her shoulders. "We knew he might, eventually." "What do you want to do?" Teresa stared at the envelope, at the name and address written in the hand of the man who had once claimed ownership of her future. Then, with sudden decisiveness, she tore the letter in half, then quarters, then eighths, letting the pieces scatter in the brisk November wind. "Nothing," she said firmly. "Harold Winters has no power over me, over us anymore. Whatever he has to say, I don't need to hear it." Matthew kissed her temple, pride and love evident in his expression. "Mrs. Nash," he said softly, "have I told you today how much I admire your courage?" Teresa smiled, leaning into his embrace as they watched the last fragments of Harold's letter disappear into the distance. "Tell me again," she suggested, her eyes alight with the joy that had become the cornerstone of their life together. 2 years after Elizabeth's birth, a son joined their family, Thomas, named in a gesture of forgiveness toward the grandfather he would never meet. Thomas Fullerton had died peacefully in his sleep the winter before, never having seen his daughter again, but having sent, in his final months, a letter expressing regret for his actions and hope for her happiness. As the years passed, Star Creek Ranch prospered, and so did the Nashes. Matthew's reputation as a horse trainer grew until he was able to purchase a parcel of land adjoining the Foster property, where he and Teresa built a larger home to accommodate their growing family. In time, the story of their flight from Colorado became something of a legend in the area, the headstrong young woman who had defied convention, and the brave cowboy who had rescued her from a loveless marriage. Teresa always laughed when she heard these romanticized versions, knowing the truth was both simpler and more profound. They had rescued each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew surprised Teresa with a trip to Denver, leaving their 3 children. Elizabeth had been joined by Thomas, and most recently little Sarah, in the capable care of Emily Foster. "Why Denver?" Teresa asked as they boarded the train, curious about his choice. Matthew's smile held a hint of mischief. "You'll see." The mystery was revealed when they arrived at their destination, not a hotel, as Teresa had expected, but a small church on the outskirts of the city, where a few guests were already gathered. Among them, Teresa recognized with a gasp of surprise, was Martha, her father's former housekeeper, now gray-haired but still straight-backed and sharp-eyed. "What is this?" Teresa asked, turning to Matthew in confusion. "A wedding," he replied softly. "Our wedding, Teresa. The one you should have had, with people who love you present to witness it." Teresa's eyes filled with tears as she looked around at the small assembly, the Fosters, who had become like family. Friends from Wyoming who had made the journey. Even a few familiar faces from Dustwater who had never approved of her father's arrangement with Harold Winters. "But we're already married," she protested weakly. Matthew took her hands in his gray eyes serious despite his smile. "Yes, we are. But 10 years ago you had to run away to choose your own path. Today, I wanted you to walk freely down the aisle, head held high, making that same choice with everyone watching." Teresa threw her arms around him, overcome by the thoughtfulness of his gift. "I love you, Matthew Nash," she whispered fiercely. "More today than I did 10 years ago, and I didn't think that was possible." The ceremony was everything their first wedding had not been celebrated openly, surrounded by friends, with no fear or secrecy shadowing the joy of the occasion. Teresa wore a gown of pale blue silk, with Elizabeth's pearl earrings at her ears and her mother's locket around her neck. As they repeated the vows they had first spoken a decade earlier, Teresa found herself reflecting on the long, winding path that had brought them to this moment. The fear and uncertainty of their escape, the challenges of building a new life together, the incomparable joy of creating a family founded on love rather than obligation, all of it had led here, to this church, to this reaffirmation of the choice she had made when she fled her father's house with nothing but a carpet bag and hope for a different future. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, though they had been such for 10 years already. "You may kiss the bride." As Matthew's lips met hers, Teresa closed her eyes, savoring the sweetness of this moment, not the beginning of their journey together, but a milestone along the way, a celebration of all they had built and all that still awaited them. Later, at the small reception held at a nearby hotel, Martha approached Teresa, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said, squeezing Teresa's hands. "She believed in marrying for love, you know. She would have approved of your Matthew." Teresa hugged the older woman tightly. "Thank you for coming, Martha. It means more than I can say." "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away," Martha replied with a chuckle. "Not after I received Mr. Nash's letter explaining what he was planning." The celebration continued into the evening, a joyous affair that left Teresa's cheeks aching from smiling and her heart full to bursting with happiness. As she and Matthew danced together beneath the hotel's crystal chandeliers, she couldn't help contrasting this night with the one that might have been her wedding to Harold Winters, surrounded by Colorado society, her smile fixed and false, her future a prison rather than a promise. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, noticing her momentary distraction. Teresa looked up at him, this man who had risked everything to give her a choice, who had built a life with her based on partnership rather than ownership, who continued to surprise her with the depth of his understanding and love. "I'm thinking about choices," she replied honestly. and how a single decision can change the course of an entire life. Matthew's arms tightened around her as they swayed to the music. "Any regrets, Mrs. Nash?" Teresa rose on her tiptoes to press a kiss to his lips, heedless of the other couples dancing around them. "Not one," she whispered. "Not a single one." They returned to Wyoming a week later, eager to reunite with their children and resume the life they had built together. As their train crossed into Wyoming territory, Teresa gazed out the window at the landscape that had become more home to her than Colorado had ever been. "Thank you," she said softly, her hand finding Matthew's. "For what?" he asked, lacing his fingers through hers. "For standing in front of that church 10 years ago, for being brave enough to fight for us, for giving me the chance to choose my own path." Teresa turned to face him fully, needing him to understand the depth of her gratitude. "You gave me freedom, Matthew, not just from Harold Winters, but freedom to become the person I was meant to be." Matthew brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You had that strength inside you all along, Teresa. I just helped you find it." As the train carried them closer to home, to the children waiting with stories to tell, to the horses Matthew was training, to the students eager for Teresa's return, to the life they had crafted together through choice and love and determination, Teresa rested her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that she had found, against all odds, exactly where she belonged. Not in the grand mansion where she was born, not in the future that had been planned for her without her consent, but here beside the man who had loved her enough to risk everything, who continued to choose her every day, just as she chose him. In the end, that was the true meaning of freedom, not the absence of bonds, but the presence of the right ones, formed by choice and strengthened by love. It was a lesson Teresa Nash had learned on a desperate night 10 years earlier, when a brave cowboy had offered her his hand and his heart, asking nothing in return but the chance to love her as she deserved to be loved. And as Wyoming rolled past their window, the future stretching before them like an open road, Teresa knew with absolute certainty that she would make the same choice again. 1,000 times over, she would choose this life, this love, this freedom. 1,000 times over, she would choose Matthew.